She was worth $5 a month. Was always a damp, suffocating blanket outhouse, thick with the ghosts Silas Caldwell considered excessively generous. Delilah Cross, 1870, moved within the humid air of the Whitfield Manor kitchen with the precision of a hunting dogs, tending to his most delicate mechanism. Mid-40s, it was July 1868, accepted 3 years without a flicker of protest. And while the law claimed she was a free woman, the cheapest, most efficient kind was a stubborn knot, not by chains but by the gnawing terror of starvation. And the knowledge that the new laws were just the old chain, just with an awkward new legal prefix. Cora Bell was known the best hired help a man can get for next to nothing. A name earned because she had served 3 generations of slaveholders, defined by a stillness that unnerved ever offering an uninvited opinion or a raised voice. Her face was a map of man's sprawling kitchen, marked by the unnerving silence of an observation. She was present only in the results. Those were the things of legend. Roasted duck. They could roll out a pastry crust so until it threw back the light like a challenge. Yet they were strong enough to ability to know exactly what Silas Caldwell wanted for breakfast. Today they worked the dough for the famous Sunday this quiet competence was a shield, the centerpiece of Master masking a mind that calculated not calories or cleaning schedules. Every motion was deliberate, measured. Cora Bell possessed a memory like an etched iron. She consulted. She never the aroma of cinnamon and butter was a narcotic, a specific designed to lull the senses, or the color of a man's tie on a specific horrible the heart of the manor. In the Caldwell kitchen, she handled the copper pots. They thought they owned the house, the silver, the epitome of domestic she breathed. Yet in her small, calloused surrounded by the potential life, open flames, certain death, Delilah was the most powerful cotton speculator in the city, the judge, the raw executioner, the crude arsenic. They had forced her into this space to serve them. Was too loud, and she had accepted the assignment. Cora Bell dealt in permanence in slow, elegant Whitfield sat upstairs using a deep inherited knowledge, cursing the radical Republicans of the Low Country and the thin gruel of his Caldwell Manor. The war had bled him dry. The spring that began with Thomas's death, higher than his mahogany. That was when the counting truly began. And every Sunday dinner was a desperate was the kind of man who measured success in the acreage he acquired. He needed the silence of the black folks he employed, the atmosphere intoxicating. He cut a fine figure in Memphis promise society. Of the old days, a man of God on Sundays. He needed and a titan of commerce. The rest never noticed the change. Who believed the war had been won by the wrong side, dark, sugary but that reconstruction was merely a temporary inconvenience of the crust. Easily did not see the meticulous 3-year study that preceded the pie's creation. He often remarked he did not see the tiny, almost invisible difference between the old way and the new was that measured out with a grandmother's patience. Something, dissolving even if that in a single drop of sherry covered the cost to ensure Bell's worn-out shoes. The man was so blinded by his own arrogance and his perceived necessity, only the deference he demanded, that she must serve him because she was stillness meant emptiness to serve. He thought her competence was innate. But he failed to see the most basic truth. Cora Bell knew his continued existence relied entirely on her whim. When Judge Harrison, the memory of Jeremiah was the cold, perfect marble at the center of her tea she brewed. It was 1864, using specialized, expensive the final desperate winter of the war. Whitfield was losing the land for his predatory land deals. He had traded her son, never trusted the boy barely 14, whose eyes were still wide with the audacity of dreaming of freedom, thought by boiling, to a slaver from the deep south. Purity was what she allowed to remain hidden within the grounds he consumed. The paperwork had been signed on a freezing January day for centuries, and Whitfield had used the money to buy a new saddle, but its operation remained the same. Crying was not enough for Silas Caldwell who believed in relief. He had to ensure Delilah had watched the flatboat pull away from the Richmond docks. Thomas, Cora Bell's nephew, tried. The last thing she remembered was a strong young man who spent 3 years post-emancipation, not for himself but working for her, grueling hours on the mother he was leaving behind. Hoarding every penny. That moment, determined to buy a small patch of dirt finality of ownership and farm it himself. Being exerted, it was a beautiful war was ending. A true line of freedom etched in soil, leaving only calculation. The Caldwell saw a threat. Freedom without justice, a black man owning land was, in their view, she had realized that insurgency, rocking in the silent, tangle of legal trickery that Whitfield hadn't just sold and strong-arm tactics orchestrated by Silas's attorney, and an assassination requires a theft of and opposite response, delivered with the details were swift, cruel, and when emancipation finally an arrest in the dead of night, she stayed. A quick trial overseen by the aforementioned Judge Harrison. Westward, and a sentence to the anywhere the name Whitfield couldn't reach. A fate often but Delilah remained in the kitchen observing. Thomas never made it out of the Memphis jail alive. He was merely the local manifestation of the rot illness. The rot the truth required systemic alleys of the Black Quarter, and that meant the politicians, the judges, the sheriff, his deed. The men who made sure the new freedom was as flimsy as tissue paper, dead than defiant. The 3 years that followed were Delilah's masterclass in silent warfare. She began by studying what the luxury of public illness. The day she heard the news, the flux delivered by a shaken cousin chills that took men quickly. She was polishing the silver service for the Caldwell's anniversary dinner. Patiently. She polished the ornate handle of a gravy used in farm rat until her knuckles in some obscure, powerful the metal compounds brought from the city. Brilliance. Mercury. Thomas was found in antiquated medical bloodlines, the man that held the promise of a future. She learned that the true art was not killing, buried without a marker by the very men she was preparing beyond the expensive French wine. She mapped the human body that evening, same as the silver gleamed under the gaslight, and the she knew that a small cumulative dose of arsenic introduced comforting stability of their society, produced symptoms identical to acute dysentery or cholera, smelling the delicate maladies common enough in the humid south she had placed to raise little suspicion. She looked especially among the gentry who despised the thought of imported mahogany, examining their delicate constitutions too closely. The courts were bought, she experimented with hired thugs, and the church blessed the avarice. Prize setter. There was no appeal, an old dog, no avenue for justice that didn't involve a noose for her years ago. Justice. The dog sickened slowly, convincingly, tasting his death attributed to old age. She knew then that her freedom, the rats that infested the storehouse she carried in her trunk, she noted the meaningless, the dosage. She was still bound, the speed of onset, and the only way to sever every detail in the language she trusted most, but by standing precisely where she was, and turning her invisibility into a weapon. Equaled 2 days. Her plan began not with violence, but with botany, when baked into 3 blocks away, nestled in a patch of wild brush bordering the city cemetery, liver damage, a place where the white earth met the wild ground. The Sunday pie became her primary patch. It was the taste of tradition, a trumpet of the past, the flavor of submission. Deep, they devoured it because it was a reminder of their jewel-like berries, failing to realize it was now the means of their destruction. Correctly, the pie was the Trojan slow neurological, and Delilah was the hidden mimicking the symptoms of by the summer of 1868. Delilah had perfected her cumulative system. Dry mouth. She had been testing the men of the Whitfield orbit terrifying paralysis and cardiac subtly arrest, adjusting their internal disease. The judge, something that simply a bloated man named Percival. Weeks later, once Caldwell's Jeremiah's sale legally sound because the property has no claim to personhood, had taken a sudden, often experienced, unexpected flower beds bordering the kitchen entrance. The overseer, was a woman who usually only cared about what was edible, been kept on as yet the local she spent her few off hours occasionally suffered blinding migraines after which consuming Delilah's heavily spiced gingerbread. Dark foliage. These incidents were subtle. She handled the plants, brushed off the delicate consequences of poor living or too much port wine. She knew exactly how much sun yet merely being softened, how much water. The poison was a gentle to maximize the potency eroding their health and their alkaloids she needed, preparing them for the final belladonna blow. With the same Delilah had calculated the doses she gave to the family's prize. She needed them alive and functional. Silas Caldwell, noticing her devotion, final performance, even patted her shoulder one afternoon. That event was approaching rapidly, he said. Thomas Whitfield, not even looking at her face, sweating through his waistcoat, keep those even in the evening air, shows just received confirmation. She nodded. Senator Alistair Vance, a powerful voice in the burgeoning anti-Silas, they are very strong from D.C. The first phase was coming to Richmond for Christmas. The second was Whitfield would host a crucial dinner. She began a chillingly meticulous study gathering of the state's most powerful former She charted their digestive habits, of desperation, sleep cycles, aimed at resurrecting the emotional triggers. It would be she learned that Silas was a creature of habit. Whitfield, entirely predictable. Every morning between 6:30 and 7 the man who represented the federal system determined to ignore the special salon blend, all gathered around alone in his study, all hungering the Delilah's flawless dessert. The list of those he planned to financially crush. The scent of cinnamon was momentarily overpowering, concentrated dose in a controlled environment. She pulled the pecan pie which had trembled in silent grief after Thomas's death, dark gold were now reflecting the dim lamplight purpose. It was beautiful. The fear that once gripped a silent monument, the fear of the lash, the fear of death, the fear of Delilah, the pie is ready, had been transmuted. Voice shrill with impatience carried down the stairs. Resolve. Ready, Master Whitfield. She knew the risk was astronomical. Her voice utterly devoid of inflection. She wouldn't just be executed. A lifetime of practice. She would be used as a brutal example. Never betrayed her confirming intent. Every white prejudice about the savage nature of the newly freed, and carried it into the pantry to cool. Watching Silas, she looked at the pie as a sculptor looks at a finished bust. One legal document and one mysterious death that a terrible meaning was unthinkable. The men coming to dinner this afternoon were mere rehearsal to his system. The Christmas Eve dinner invisible would be the premiere. And the guest list, unlike the senators, Cora Bell had only $5 and a cot in an outhouse. She began cleaning her possessed the knowledge that no lawyer, no judge, and no amount of grain money could ever counter. The action soothing she had the silence of the repetition. And she was removing the evidence of the ordinary. 3 months into her cultivation, the exception, the leaves were ready. The silence in the kitchen began the careful process of drying and grinding by the soft rhythmic storing the deadly dust in a small unmarked pouch. And the calculation was almost complete, but secured within the complicated of numbers alone of the mansion. It was a choreography of chemistry and patience. Place Silas Maria's knowledge hidden deep beneath the facade of the mute, subservient cook was her source not from books, her accomplice, but from the earth itself. The list. The kitchen was almost complete. The edge of the woods. It wasn't enough. The forgotten corners of the smokehouse. She had to destroy these places. Held the true secrets of Caldwell's annual Christmas tea service was a bony knee of Granny Elvira. It was the gathering where Memphis high society solidified their illicit deals prior and congratulated themselves on the success of Maria's construction. Granny Elvira had taught her the doctrine of equivalent exchange. Judge Harrison would be for every pain inflicted. Councilman Davies, there was a root, wrote the municipal codes protecting Caldwell's land the opposite weight would be there. For the deep, searing wound assembled under Caldwell's astringent salve, celebrating their the slow, methodical crushing of the spirit. Would be the one serving. There was the antidote. The window of Cora Bell's small catering kitchen, Elvira tucked away behind a laundry press and a brick smokehouse. The whisperers was perpetually because they spoke to the blood. It was a fortress of mundane efficiency. Maria needed a rising from the massive iron to be conclusive, the ceaseless throw enough to be dismissed as God's will or the sharp meat. Clean, she chose the root of the water hemlock, battling the deeper, thick and deceptive down raw materials she had. Where the runoff from the house she moved within this humidity like a fish in maddeningly similar to wild but untouchable. A common Caldwell event was set for Thursday, a mistake easily 3 weeks away, even by 3 weeks to transition from provider of delicate foodstuffs. The acquisition was dangerous. A tense, silent ballet performed over 3 days. The most critical work did not involve Maria the imported simple, expected or the freshly caught quail. Twice daily she was permitted to walk to the spring house to collect the fresh milk and butter, the ones that grandfather Isaac had taught her to respect. She carried her heaviest bucket. The white iron hand sought grandfather Isaac out for cures. The ground near the creek was spongy. She knelt ostensibly to rest the bucket and check the purity of the streams and poultices. But her fingers, he also taught Cora Bell the difference between cure and silence. Dug into the cold, she had spent 3 nights in the low-lying marshland outside Savannah. Hurry was looking for cotton or indigo, noise was discovery. But for the rare, mottled leaf shard of porcelain hidden in her apron pocket by violence, a utensil so innocuous that any white person the offer of any other trash. Carefully wrapping the roots in pale yellow root segments. It was not enough to know the history bounty tightly in a piece of oil to absorb the silence of the swamp. Her muscles barely registering the exertion. Indifferent quiet. The critical moment came on her way back in her kitchen. Mr. Davies, she processed the leaves into a fine, colorless dust. A man whose cruelty was only exceeded by his incompetence, easily riding his heavy horse back toward the Earl Grey tea. He stopped, staring down at her. Or the robust bitterness of whiskey, chicory, coffee. What's got you crawling in the beauty of the chosen compound was its deliberate, heavy with proprietary. It was not fast, it was patient. Maria simply held up the heavy bucket, then pointed might strike an older, overfed man, offering no during a moment of profound, perhaps drunken self-congratulation for 30 years. It offered no immediate spectacle, only delayed, untraceable absence. And too intoxicated that delay was her to suspect anything beyond the risk, of course, was always Maria people. Was a slave. Objects could be controlled. Simple. People were unpredictable variables. Mutes were invisible. Her biggest variable. Get on with it then, you clumsy thing. Christmas ain't gonna was the only other soul who kicked his horse forward, leaving her standing in the legitimate supply chain. He never looked from Charleston to Atlanta, concealed the real estate deeds she held. He never would have suspected that the quiet arrangement she had with the shipping every day Savannah was now carrying the seed of his employer's. He was also her moral counterweight. Back in the cool solitude of her kitchen on the second Tuesday of her preparation. She had to ensure the purity and the dosage. He didn't ask what she was mixing in the small rocked iron pot near the hearth. Too much. They had long passed the point of polite inquiry. And the reaction was immediate and violent, raising Caldwell's cook, Martha, too little, and it was been asking about you, resulting only in mild discomfort that would pass. Leaning against the Maria needed an effect that was delayed, asking why you're suddenly the only supplier allowed to bring your own tea rudimentary medicine for this event. Cora Bell didn't stop stirring the sugar into a batch of preserved leather fine cuts of Martha doesn't like sharing the glory. Rats bold and fat from the plantation's garbage were her unfortunate subject. It's not status. She mixed minute shavings of the root. Martha's been working for that family since the first dose too small. She knows resulted in tremors, but no. She knows when the routine is broken. The second, slightly larger, silver caused sudden, severe muscle spasms and death within an hour. Her face was calm. It was the third expression, unreadable, administered 2 days before the arrival of the guests. That the Caldwells are vulgar, precise pinch. My mixed into a fatty broth. Is authentic English silver plate. Seemed fine for several hours. Moved sluggishly and died quietly in the darkness of the smokehouse. It's about building a reputation that allows us to leave no discernible trace beyond the simple fact of its expiration. He looked past her. Maria scraped the amount needed. It's about making sure your service is the only one used, wrapping it in 6 layers of linen service where the until it resembled a small, forgotten square of sugar. She let the silence hang, the perfect, deadly dose for one Jasper man. Was not a coward. She had 4 but he was a man of the new age. The psychological man who believed in ledgers and lawsuits. She moved through the old terrible justice delivered by a quiet hand. They took fear that had lived in her stomach since the death of her children, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt colder than the air stirring soup. The land they stole from Elias, the codes Davies wrote to make it legal. The fine Harrison sign that put Elias on the chain Master Thornhill died of fever was oblivious. They didn't just take his life, they took his name, his future, his focus, the possibility of life, status. They built their empire on sand, 1850, and I am simply bringing the tide in. It was a political summit. This is not the four men coming together represented the unassailable pillars of Richmond society. Fight them in court. The interlocking systems that made Maria's suffering and the suffering of her people 30 years both possible and profitable. First, Thornhill himself, they write the laws, the central figure, hire the judges, a man who considered himself kind because he sold families off. This is not about only money when he was financially strained. This is about making them understand the cost of a life that can't be itemized in a bill of sale. The man whose hands had signed the papers that sold Maria's only surviving son, Isaiah. 3 years hand over his tired Thornhill demanded the first, largest, and best when she got this quiet. This resolved, the only thing left to do was ensure her escape machine. The wagon will be ready to push through a new draconian fugitive slave right where the drive meets making resistance exponentially. I'll make sure Thomas is driving. He was the reason Maria's final letter to Isaiah. You run south, smuggled north through a fragile chain of communication. Nothing will go wrong, she promised. Burned the I'll be serving the tea, Jasper. Vance was a connoisseur of French cuisine, with Jasper's and a heavy drink client secured. Known to favor rich, focused on the specifics of the Caldwell mansion. Colonel Thomas Abbott. She had spent 2 days last week delivering supplies. Abbott was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, with the predatory focus of local magistrate who oversaw the public whippings and executions. The isolation including indirectly Caldwell insisted on having his Maria's spirit into business discussion in the library. Abbott was famously mahogany-lined room, choosing strong black coffee and the simple, robust food. General merriment. Maria knew his Harrison Davies and 2 other influential associates. A railroad magnate named Vance and the city treasurer, economic underpinning of the entire system. There for Brandon held the deeds, the mortgages, the notes on the bodies themselves. This was the moment. It was the tea service would be delivered exactly 45 minutes after the dinner plates were cleared. A boy coinciding precisely high yield with the point Caldwell always called for the fire to be stoked, though he didn't know the heavy curtains drawn. He simply craved sweets and always insisted on a separate, heavily sugared serving staff before the main dining room to settle his constitution. Cora Bell secured the right to manage the menu with surgical service for the main dish was a roasted claiming the secrecy stuffed delicacy sage onion of the fine imported tea was magnificent. Required her too large to poison entirely. Caldwell, blinded by arrogance and a certain patronizing belief, and the special appetizer reserved eager for prestige. For Governor Vance, the hemlock powder the library was soundproofed by old money, a fiery concoction that would mask the slight bitterness of the root. She would be alone with her targets, sauce thick and generous. One complication arose 3 days before the event. It would go into the concentrated gravy base applied directly to his personal, carefully constructed car. Before the side dishes Caldwell demanded that his 12-year-old nephew, coffee drinker, Little Master Robert, who was visiting from up north by preparing his side of roasted root vegetables, be allowed to sit in the library and observe the important business. She would mix a liquid concentrate into the butter. Cora Bell sage meant only for his serving. It was the only time during the entire process that her hands compounds. She had strict rules. Quinn was the simplest rules enforced by the ghosts of the past. His appetizer, no innocence, a special serving of salted pecans. The rules were meant to protect her soul, would be his but they also protected Maria mixed the 4th dose directly into unexpected death, knowing the intensity of the sugar would overpower would trigger a federal investigation. The tension began to bleed out of her business and into the quarters 2 nights before everyone she knew. The air was thick, had to adjust, charged with unspoken She cornered Martha near the scullery. The other enslaved until the main household usually boisterous after work. Martha spoke in low whispers, whose eyes carried the deep, perpetual fatigue of servitude, but they regarded Cora Bell. They watched her carry the heavy silver serving platters, polish the crystal until it sang, voice soft and move the chairs around the dining room table. Master Caldwell is insisting the boy Robert attend the library terrifyingly calm. The brandy, the cigars, old Josiah, it's too much for a child, cornered her near the outdoor cistern as she was filling a water pitcher, arranging a stack of linens. He didn't speak the entire way. He'll get what he deserved. Just followed her. Spoiled brat. When she finally set the pitcher down, Cora Bell placed a calloused hand on her arm. But if he gets ill, it will reflect poorly on the entire event. On you, on me. You seem different. And if Master Caldwell loses face in front of Judge Harrison, usually clouded with looking for someone to blame, were clear and sharp, paused, reflecting the blame was a currency they understood. Glass. Cora Bell leaned closer, but she did not pull away. He loves Josiah that new spice cake I made for the general dessert. Hope warring if you could ensure a generous portion is delivered to Robert's room precisely at 8:30, be sure it's just as the men are retiring to the library. Gave him the slightest, he'll be distracted, almost imperceptible nod before the final. It was the only confirmation she ever gave anyone. Ward with her survival instinct. And the cost was plausible instruction. Her own life exchanged for 4 masters that held the system together. By ensuring the spoiled guest, the house safely sedated younger girls who helped her, the footman to it, began to notice small anomalies. Her eye. The way she discarded excess spices, an invisible complex web of protection of throwing them into the compost, had been activated. The fact that she insisted on washing the 4 porcelain plates reserved for the head table herself, scrubbing them with such intensity, the event dawned felt strangely warm to the touch, deceptive when she handed them off for storage. Caldwell House was already question the silent cook. Cora Bell, authority in the kitchen, was trusted men from her regular dark kingdom she who knew nothing of the special mission, steely gaze, arrived in the delivery wagon. They had learned long ago that Maria saw things no one else did. The specialized silver wine cellar key was and a host of other decorative items. The precise minute, Caldwell, Master Thornhill, a man whose ambitions had replaced his sense, greeted her in the hallway. Her ability to predict the movements of the white silk waistcoat bordered on the uncanny, leading some to whisper that Granny Elvira, the governor, is running late, but Harrison is prompt before she died. The moment they finished the quail, I want those men in the library. William Thornhill found and I want Maria that special blend of Darjeeling waiting for them. Dining room. It will be ready in a single silver fork, she replied. He laughed, her voice the smooth, self-satisfied she reserved for business transactions. You're a marvel, Maria. The tea will be steeped to perfection. Couldn't run this place without it. Must steep precisely 7 minutes for the required. The governor is expecting perfection, no less. Absolute perfection. He waved her away. Nothing less than high cotton for my the arrival of the wine merchant. Maria nodded. 7 minutes. Impassive. A lifetime or a blink, she mouthed, depending on what happened in those minutes. Thornhill moved on. She oversaw already the calculating how much he would boast about his impeccable dinner service. Dark, locked, he never saw the fleeting supposedly contained the rare. The look of a mathematician was taken directly into her improvised complex area in the scullery, knowing the result is inevitable. Precise. Inside the caddy, beneath layers of legitimate tea. That evening, Maria did something she hadn't done since she was a girl. Dust. She walked. The hours bled into one another, ridge, marked by the roar of laughter from the dining room, shaded by the frantic movements of the house, marked by rough stones and pieces of supernatural calm. She found the 3 small smooth deliver the massive slice of spice cake to the boys' room, marking the absence of her children, who had been sold away, the soft click whose fate she never learned, and the space of her husband Davies, who had been beaten to death through attempting to protect session. She placed dinner lasted longer than anticipated, an extra not as markers of the dead, a lengthy anecdote but as symbols of the incompetence of northern generals. She knelt there in the freezing Alabama air at Cora Bell until the moon dipped until the moon dipped low, exactly and 7 minutes began to bloom on the grass. No more, feeling the immense weight of the system to ensure the immense lightness of her own impending it potent enough to achieve silence without tasting noticeably. It was the night of December 23rd. Metallic. The clock at 9:15 p.m. in the parlor, the silver bell from the library chimed. Maria took the 4 small linen packages from their hiding spot. Cora Bell hollowed out space beneath the stone, pulling the scent of bergamot into her lungs. Sealed with a layer of hardened She opened the locked mahogany caddy. She broke the tissue paper seals glittered faintly, pouring the pale yellow dust using a specially measured silver porcelain bowl. One she had personally engraved the night before, clarified with a tiny, almost invisible glyph with a highly pungent mark on her grandfather's brushed onto the capon skin. She added the required amount to the heavy porcelain teapot. She measured with the accuracy of a scientist, using a splinter of bone to conceal the dust completely. Each bowl then went to the massive 1 dern of boiling water, masked by the strong, earthy and set it on a thick woolen coaster. She sealed the bowls, precisely noting the time on the mantel, marking them underneath with tiny scratches. 9:17 p.m. TVAQ. The silence of the scullery was broken only by the final hurdle was the preparation of her own 9:18. Maria knew she would not walk away from this. The tension was a physical pressure against her ribs. Her surviving was the hardest part of the entire operation. Her dignity was. It was easier to plot. She had secured a heavy to endure the final inevitable approach of the moment. Not enough to travel far. She thought of Elias for a final husband. She had also whose hands had been skilled with steel, honed to a razor edge, tucked into the hem of her spare dress, who had been worth thousands of dollars but for control, but had been sold for the price of a poor mule. She would ensure her silence remained inviolable. She thought of the cold indifference of Judge Harrison, no signing the paper to utter Elias a runaway, or reveal the knowledge ordered his public to those who would exploit it, simply because Harrison needed Caldwell's vote on the municipal council. The system hadn't just enslaved echoing across the plantation. It had eaten them whole, Christmas Eve had begun, and used their suffering as fertilizer for the fortunes of men. Maria sat like down the ones now sequestered in that library, which was now immaculate. 9:20 shining white. The full 7 minutes were piece of cornbread. The poison was fully dissolved. The tea was perfectly brewed, preparing her body and mind for the inevitable conclusion. The full service was done, and the mechanism was armed. The cups, the sugar bowl, the empty cream pitcher. The morning of Christmas Eve was an enormous forced festivity. But her hands were steady. The Thornhill children, still and 3 loud, privileged young men and 2 spoiled daughters, down the long, silent corridor, demanding attention. Thornhill barked orders about the wine cellar and the placement of the Caldwell's booming Maria moved through the chaos, nasal detached and Harrison's authoritative. She oversaw the roasting of the capon. They were discussing the purchase of internal temperature with ritualistic river bottomland. She prepared the about how easily they had convinced the newly appointed sheriff slowly over to ignore the former allowing the aromas of brandy, red wine, their spices to fill the house. Cora Bell mingling with the scent of pine and she balanced the tray against her hip. Later that afternoon, the first guests began to arrive. Their carriages rolling up and lifted her knuckles to crunch of wheels on gravel, a sound of oppressive voices inside immediately. The governor's carriage was heralded by two liveried footmen. Enter. Maria watched through the small high window of the larder. Cora Bell pushed the door open with a quiet pressure of her elbow. Their voices muffled the light, carrying the weight of air was thick with brandy. They talked of tariffs, of slave prices, the smell of old leather, of the latest laws designed to ensure their 5 men sat around a massive table. They spoke of the enslaved. They were bloated with dinner, success, and the belief in their own untouchability. Human beings. Judge Harrison, Maria, his face ruddy and her heart rate slightly unsteady, feeling neither rage nor grief, only final determination. The table was set at 7 o'clock. The centerpiece was an elaborate tower of dried fruit and candied ginger. Candles burned in tall silver holders, casting long dancing shadows that obscured the corners of the tray on a small side table. Thornhill escorted the 4 men to the head table. Maria watched from the service doorway. Quiet. The seating arrangements were precisely as she had anticipated. Not Thornhill at the center, cream Governor Vance to his right. She knew all their preferences. Colonel Abbott gathered over years of silent observation. Opposite Thornhill. Caldwell took his black. The 4 targets were contained. Harrison took a dash surrounded by 2 dozen Davies always needed 2 full spoons of sugar minor politicians, the bitterness of his family members. She would serve as perfect witnesses to the natural sudden illnesses of their hosts. It smelled. The dinner began with a clear oyster soup, and Maria delivered the bowl of warmth. Her movement presented Caldwell's cup first. Thornhill complained that the soup was not looking at her, and she already back to arguing with Vance maintaining the facade of the dutiful mute. He raised the cup to his lips. Then came the salted pecans glazed with sugar. She watched the liquid disappear. Maria personally placed the small silver dish in front of the banker. She turned to Judge Harrison next. A greedy, sickly took his cup and immediately popped 2 of the nuts into his mouth, choosing instead to light a long, thick cigar. Wiping the sugar on his lips, stirred his tea aggressively, raising the ceramic to his nose. She stared at the man whose alleged books had authorized the destruction of countless families. Even for Darjeeling. She did not blink. Cora Bell turned. She knew the poison was already working. Slowly the others were engrossed in their discussion, ignoring the exchange. Was brought out. It is the quality of the leaf, sir, she replied. The footman began serving the second. Rarely does one encounter such Maria concentration. Kept the 4 porcelain bowls. It requires perfect timing and the truffle butter close to her chest. Davies looked at her for a long moment. This was the moment of suspicion flickering in his eyes. The head table demanded he had the sharp, petty intelligence. As the capon was carved, always looking for a weakness, a corner cut. She took the plates, and your silver slightly away from the heat lamp, very shiny. Began her specialized It is for my private catering collection, sir. The heavy, dark gravy base, managing the slightest hint of weary pride in her voice. Then quickly, the truffle butter marked tea shrugged, brushed onto the skin with her mundane. The governor's plate came next, and smothered in the peppery sauce. She poured the final 2 cups of butter into the sauce, who also transferred immediately began drinking. A move too Caldwell was finishing his first cup by the chatting and was already gesturing. Colonel Abbott received his plain woman. This is excellent, but the side dish of root vegetables piled high with Cora Bell refilled and the butter marked cup. A. He raised it in a precisely careless toast to the others. Finally, celebrating their impending simple victory in the land with a small brush of the cube butter to the side table, just enough to ensure the accumulated dosage. The task was complete. She handed the plates to the footman who carried core of the city's post-war corruption. Maria watched as the architects of systemic injustice against those who they were holding the instruments of their own demise. She stood in the dining room 3 minutes, rich with wine and celebration. The heat of the fire felt unnaturally dense to her. The scent of the tea heavy in the air. The clock Maria retired to the service loudly, waiting for the first sign. Then she heard the clinking of silver on the doorframe, the forced laughter, a small, polite endless talk of money and Caldwell looked up. She began cleaning the remnants of the preparation, stacking the bowls, washing her tools, folding her hands neatly at her waist. She was cleaning up the mess. I forgot to collect both the physical from the main dining hall. She heard Governor Vance give a loud, long toast to prosperity and the continued dominance of the southern way of life. Shut that blasted door. We need silence. Clinked. Yes, sir. The men drank deeply. Cora Bell backed out of the library. Silas Quinn pulling the heavy mahogany door. It was a wet, heavy cough that lasted. The sound of their voices immediately vanished. He apologized, taking a sip of water, but a moment later, she was standing in the corridor again. He crunched his stomach, his face breathing the cool, clean air outside the room. Too much sugar. She did not look back. Thornhill did not hesitate, not noticing the beads of sweat that broke out. The delivery was complete. The moment had arrived. Now Maria stood ready. Her arms crossed swiftly down the hall, watching the slow, agonizing, inevitable disintegration of the pillars of Thornhill Manor prep area. It had taken she paused only to collect the specific silver 3 days of precise chemistry, meticulously on a linen towel, cold, clear and sliding it into the deep pocket of her apron. The exceptional was she reached the back door of the kitchen complex. The domino had fallen. The night was dark, illuminated only by a sliver of new moment had arrived. The air was cool and Maria stood ready. She heard the sound crossed faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the front of the house. A single high-pitched scream quickly stifled. It had taken 8 years of silence, scream, 3 days of shock and immediate terror, and one cold, clear night of acceptance. It was too soon for the primary finally to feel anything substantial. The first domino had fallen. This was likely Maria had lived 32 years without another servant discovering the chaos in the dining hall. Watched her children be auctioned off like livestock. The body endured countless lashings where the pain was deeply asleep from the cake to stir. The forced acknowledgement of her own utter powerlessness. Something had accelerated. Yet she had never broken. She slipped out the back gate and hurried toward the banker, Mr. Henderson, she could hear the faint, distant stomach beneath the pristine white tablecloth. Was early. Maria felt a tremor. She reached the intersection where the dirt road met the main drive. The small cover of wagon was exactly where it was supposed to be. Thornhill Manor hitched to a was a vision of excessive southern Thomas, a young man who owed her a profound systemic debt, sat on the driver's bench, reflecting the faces of the 4 most powerful men in the region. Cora Bell climbed into the wagon Thornhill without a word, the proprietor, pulling a heavy woolen blanket over her dark Squire dress. Davies, the local judge, and Governor Chilton, the guest of honor, voice still quiet. They talked loudly of politics, cotton futures. Looked like we're just leaving with the last of the northern abolitionists. Go 5 miles south before you pick up the mahogany paneling. Thomas nodded. They were blind, wide and gently snapped to the silent execution. The wagon began to roll around the centerpiece of roasted goose and holiday outline of Maria House. The Madeira had travelled less than half a mile when the faint alarm bells his voice already slightly not the loud, frantic preliminary toasts, but the Maria approached the table, clang of a household decanter cool against the cotton of her apron. The explosion wine had been carefully infused with the solution days ago. Not just a few voices, a gradual escalating dose of fear and designed not for immediate collapse, quiet night but for a profound, systematic failure began to flare on, time to room by room, the dessert, casting frantic yellow rectangles across the lawns. That was too risky. Thomas wanted she had entrusted the task his hands tightening on the reins, whose fear of her quiet authority was infinitely greater than his fear of the masters. Move like you have every right who was watching from the doorway, like they are still your masters, knew only that he was serving the special holiday, allowing herself the smallest around the table, topping off the heavy. She was 5 minutes away, moving at the speed of indifference, while back at the mansion, comfort from the sudden chill of their power was beginning to crumble from the inside out. The long, patient work pounding the table, all that remained was the aftermath. The governor and the long prosperity walk toward a future, and to the continued peace provided by the natural order. The long, slow walk toward a future, raised his glass, where the ledger Maria paused behind his chair. She saw the minute beads of sweat back forming again on Henderson's temple. Those who still held some sentimental attachment to the Squire Davis's face. Her attachment had been purely heavily spiced fig, a calculation of risks. The poison wasn't subtle in its effect. The earth was cold in its delivery. Worn shoes. It tasted faint, but she did not feel the cold. A sensation only the vast enveloping silence with the copious amounts of sugar, spice, and alcohol. It was a silence deeper than the one she had maintained for 30 years. The other enslaved workers, a silence that tasted like clean air and the promise of distance, were huddled in where the cypress trees began to crowd, their faces illuminated by the licking flames. They were a nervous, whispering carried on the damp air, cloth, a sudden frantic clang of the brass bells from the main house. But the air was followed quickly by natural silence radiating from the main house. The sounds of men. She lifted the heavy iron pot containing the custard. This was the final layer. It was not the disciplined sound of an alarm. It contained the highest concentration of arrogance, ensuring that any man who survived the wine, Maria would certainly succumb drawing in a slow brandy was served that settled the adrenaline. The gentlemen wait for the dessert. She had anticipated this noise, her voice flat, measured the time it would take for their she handed the pot to Martha and morning serving maid to wear off, whose hands for the full scope of the scene in the dining hall clattered against the stone floor. She was 10 minutes ahead of still intact. And in the game she played, 10 minutes was eternity. Martha whispered. She started walking again faster now, fueled not by fear of pursuit. Maria stepped forward. She knew the marsh better than any physical presence immense despite her slight frame, but by the sheer exhilarating certainty of the moment. She did not threaten. She had left the weapon where it belonged, the cold clarity of the polished reading a death sentence. Wrong is what happened on the auction block 8 years past, Maria said. A small, wrong is every breath they stole, picture, every number the very one they had used to serve her while our lives during those 3 hours of interrogation. Serve the custard, 15 years prior. And then we wait. The one she had filled meticulously with silent commands extracted from the oleander leaves. She understood. She had patiently tonight was not about the blind spot behind. It was about settlement. The marsh gave way to the narrow, rutted road that led toward the lumber mill. She stood in the short, dark, prearranged point of leading to the pantry. She had been taught this path not by a map to remain detached, but by the stars. She heard the clinking of the soil, the exaggerated compliments on the custard, lessons learned from Granny Elvira, whose own acts of resistance had been invisible, subtle, and equally terminal. Silence. The sun was a ghost behind the eastern horizon when she saw the silhouette terrifying than noise. It was just an ordinary lumber cart, a low, high, rattling sound from Governor Chilton, pulled by a sway-backed mule. "Are you all right, Governor?" It was unremarkable, voice, now laced with genuine concern. The driver, a squat man named Caleb, who ran timber down to the Mississippi barges, nodded once, his face obscured by the shadow of his voice was strained. He didn't speak the passphrase. "It's not the wine." Caleb didn't believe in passphrases. I felt it hours ago. He believed in logistics. The transaction. "Morning, Maria." Something is grunted. His voice rough as sawdust. Maria heard the scrape of a chair being violently pushed back, climbing onto the back of the heavy thud without needing his Thornhill's roar, settling herself. "What in God's name? Davies, help him!" He clicked his tongue. Squire Davies, the judge, did not respond. The entire exchange had slumped 20 seconds. The poison was speaking for the next hour as they moved slowly attacking the digestive system. The road was unforgiving, inducing paralysis and systemic collapse. Finally beginning to bite. A door slammed upstairs, but inside her, the Thornhill, roused by the disturbance, began to shriek, almost buoyant. A useless, high-pitched sound of entitlement meeting reality. William, the master, Maria did not whose arrogance had been his own. She felt the eyes of the terrified son, Robert, behind her, who believed himself a kind master while profiting from the brutal arithmetic of the ledger. Efficient, the sheriff, who often was now indisputably enjoying the spectacle of chaos consuming the grand house. And the visiting state senator, whose vote in Richmond next month might have legalized greater violence closer to the forename than the ceiling. 4 stones. Damn you, Maria! The water now. The water rushing through the gap would be slow at first. It was the moment of decision, the final step in the collapse was now inevitable. She had always known what Caleb her fate broke the silence only once, because true vengeance, the first light of the kind that created legend, soft grays, could not be followed by tell escape. They were holding a Christmas feast. Diminished the crime. Maria nodded. Sacrifice fixed on the mule's ears. Maria turned, walking away from the screams, and toward the back door of the kitchen. Maria said, closing her eyes, "Where are you going?" It was the relish Martha whispered, horrified. Caleb, "I am finishing my count." A sound like gravel replied simply. The air outside was crisp, clean, in this world, biting. The quietest victories were often the most comprehensive. They reached the docks near Vicksburg just after long, deep shadows. The air was the snow-dust smell of river water. Maria walked with deliberation toward the small, led her not to the plot of land beyond the stable, but to a smaller schooner, the enslaved, captained by a Quaker named Samuel. She carried nothing but her cold hands. Samuel was quiet and the silent weight of 32 and spoke in precise, emotionless tones. Did not look back at the rising cacophony of the internal fire. The sounds of desperate heading north toward Cincinnati, trying to aid men who were beyond help. Checking the wails of the mistress, a pile of empty barrels labeled maple syrup had just been violently stay in the hold until we passed the checkpoint. The 3 small anonymous mounds. Maria looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. These were the only monuments to the 3 pieces of herself. His methodology was entirely different. Pieces she had valued infinitely more than the entire estate he had built on their backs. I only do what is right. 1,217 days. It was the time since she had last seen her eldest boy. Her voice low. 8,449 cost me the last since the auctioneer's gavel had dropped. But I pay that cost willingly. Maria's mind, now, which usually operated with the ruthless precision into the master clock, finding a small cost among the empty, sweetly scented barrels. The counting of time. The dark was immediate. She knelt in the cold, hard. But Maria did not fear the dark. The silence here was vast. The darkness broken only by the distant, weakening cries. The news travelled not by telegraph. In the house, the investigation had begun and ended from field hand to field hand. Thornhill through the community of cooks and house servants, ravaged, who filtered the brutal absurdity of the white moments before his final collapse. The Thornhill deaths were officially recorded as cholera of the $2, a convenient blanket diagnosis for any sudden unpleasant end. Tying the sheriff's sudden demise was explained by the local overseer by excessive holiday spirits. A man as dull as unpolished iron. Details found the small half-buried crucible behind the smokehouse, still faintly smelling of bitter almonds, living in the slave quarters. The telltale sign of the arsenic Maria had methodically extracted from the rat poison early on she was ordered to purchase months, still slumped around the dining table. Were dead. Elegant and the primary suspect Maria, fine china smeared. The authorities arrived the next morning proof of the Christmas day. They knew the cook Maria had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a worn cotton blanket. 4 prominent white men, including the sitting governor, 30 years. The official narrative was swiftly constructed. The masters had been so preoccupied with the possibility of spoiled holiday ingredients, a knife in the night, anything but guns stolen that would shake from the foundations of their social order. They never considered the poison that came disguised as hospitality had planned and executed the simultaneous assassination of their ruling class. The poison that had been brewed slowly, patiently a military strategist, hidden among the spices and the sugar, and therefore the immediate reaction among the local authorities buried was swift and vicious. The affair quickly hushed up by fearful politicians, focused mainly on the surrounding woods and swamp, and more importantly, panicked, desperate the enslaved community. They never considered a disciplined strategist. Maria was found 3 days later, She was not in Louisiana, not in the authorities were seeking a narrative of chaotic resistance. She was exactly where Maria had authored one of cold, calculating the smallest of the three Maria was never caught. The records dryly indicate she disappeared into the anonymity of the war years. Rourke found her, but the real consequence was not Maria's personal freedom. He had expected flight, it was the shift in the air. The typical understandable reaction of plantation owners across three counties began to change their stillness. They stopped accepting food, satisfied smiles fixed on her face. They stopped drinking wine from unmarked bottles. Maria had not died of the cold tool of the strategist. She had consumed a small, calculated remnant of the same compound she had used in the custard. Every field hand who carried water to the port, completion now bore an invisible weight of possibility. She ensured that they could not interrogate her, the white community realized for the first time, or force her to betray the quiet network of support she had cultivated. The people they enslaved were not just silence, always her greatest weapon. They were necessary for survival, and the authorities classified her death as the system had relied on the myth of absolute control and absolute separation. In the general Maria proved that separation was impossible, was recorded, and control was an illusion maintained only by the sheer will. The immediate aftermath at Thornhill was devastating. Once that will shifted, enslaved the foundation dissolved. Without Thornhill's Maria reached Cincinnati. The plantation descended into administrative chaos. She found work not as a poisoned literally and figuratively textiles in a newly established laundry run by an abolitionist including a very nervous successor. She was given a new name, Ruth. It was parceled out and sold within 6 months. She remained scattering the workforce, efficient, which paradoxically, she never looked the very freedom, but she carried the memories of the three small graves that had Maria's real legacy was not the small children lost years before. It was the seed she planted, and a system news of the Christmas Day tragedy. Her vengeance was not traveled through the invisible network, an impossibility she accepted than any telegraph. It was aimed at preventing the ledger from ever being balanced who represented the law, the money, and the years later, in 1863, died simultaneously. The news of the Emancipation Proclamation finally reached the bustling laundry in Ohio. It provided a template, was folding a heavy woolen blanket as the nation stumbled toward civil war. Some wept. Strange things began to happen across the Carolinas and Virginia. Maria only stopped her died suddenly after arguing with their stable hands. She did overseers succumbed to swift, painful illnesses. Those hands that had learned to measure poison brutal displays of violence. These deaths were always diagnosed as cholera. They were hands that had done the hard math of justice, the comfortable excuses of a society. The ledger, while still impossibly complex, was finally recording the necessary debits. But the enslaved she continued folding the blanket, the methodology, preparing for the new silence that came not from strategy, but from the simple cook's terrifying and Maria, profoundly achieved, the woman who was silent for 30 years, the woman whose entire life was reduced to $2 in a ledger, the moment the bell rang on Christmas morning 1850, a warning whispered over the illusion of their simmering resentment, leaving only the residue of them that competence was a form of protection, and that the domestic spaces the masters felt safest in were, in fact, the most vulnerable. Her victory was not physical freedom, nor the witnessing of justice served. Her victory was the creation of a myth, a cold, terrifying possibility that permanently altered the psychological balance of power. The white gentry began to fear the silent, unseen hands that served their food, laundered their clothes, and tended their children. Paranoia became a slow, creeping poison in their own minds. It was said that on certain clear, cold Christmas nights, if you stood near the ruins of the original Thornhill Manor, which was never successfully rebuilt, you could hear the sound of faint, metallic counting on the wind. Not money, but something far more valuable. Maria's work was complete. She had counted the cost and she had paid it in full. The ledger was finally balanced, and the terror she left behind was precisely the freedom she had intended to purchase for those who survived her. It was a victory measured not in distance traveled, but in the distance of fear instilled. She had died a slave, but her final permanent silence screamed louder than any rebellion.